We welcome back author and .Earth blogger Andrew Revkin, who's joining us all this week from New York City. Last night, we looked at eco-friendly initiatives for cities. Tonight, we look at the benefits and pitfalls of conservation and efficiency. Hi, Andrew.
Hey, it's good to be with you.
Energy efficiency has been called the fifth fuel, if you will, behind petroleum and coal and nuclear and renewables. How do you see it fitting in its importance amongst this group?
Well, it's always step one, using energy more carefully and ending up using less, and overall is a prime opportunity. And it's what Amory Lovins you came up, I think it was Amory who came up with the term negawatts with an N, meaning, and they're always cheap because just simply figuring out a way to use less energy is implicitly cheaper than finding new sources. And it's kind of step one. It's even where I live in a rural community, we were rehabilitating the library, and the first thing we looked at was the basic structure of the building before we looked at changing over the furnace to a more efficient system. You want to make sure you're not sort of just plugging holes in a leaky boat is not really the way to go unless you really reassess the whole structure. So that's step one always.
I guess the question, though, is that, you know, politically, the discussions are often about the other four. And I'm wondering, do you think there's enough discussion about energy efficiency?
Not really, no. It's always been sort of the stranded sister over on the sidelines, partially because there's no lobby for it. You know, there's a lobby for natural gas, a lobby for coal, a lobby for nuclear, and lobbies for solar and wind. But there's no big industrial, powerful institution saying use less. And of course, we're also pummeled by all kinds of advertising and marketing slogans from the time we're toddlers onward that are telling us mostly use more of whatever it is. So it's a tough go.
Let me ask you this. There's something called the Jevons Paradox, which in my layman's understanding of it is something about energy efficiency doesn't necessarily mean we'll be more efficient. And that seems counterintuitive to me, but explain it to me.
Well, unless there's some other factor tamping down use, you can end up with energy efficient behaviors leading to more use of energy. And it's kind of, you can understand this, there's several different forms of this phenomenon. Jevons was looking at coal use in the 1800s and noticed that it basically did calculations that said that overall when you use something more carefully, the price goes down, so you can buy more of it and use more of it. And that's only one form of the kind of ballooning that can happen. There's two basic ways this can play out. Suppose you, the homeowner, you put in better light bulbs. You might tend to leave the lights on longer, first of all. So you just think less about it because with the compact fluorescence, it's a 1/4 of the energy use, so what the heck. Or you'll end up in a bigger way, in a macroeconomic way. As you use less energy, you're actually having more wealth to spend on more stuff and more economic activity, which in the end builds out more use of energy. And historically, that's kind of the way the world has gone. So we've, in the United States and Canada and most developed countries, the intensity of energy, how much energy goes into making widget X, selling it, moving it around, using it, has gone down progressively over time. But that hasn't resulted in a shrinking energy menu for the country. And then when you look forward, it's pretty much a given that the world, especially heading toward having 2 or 3 billion more people, and with a burgeoning middle class, will have at least double today's energy appetite by somewhere toward mid-century. And you know, that leads you to some pretty stark questions about you know, how do you keep efficiency in the mix? It's vital, but then how do you actually then modulate behaviors even to take account of that tendency of us to keep on growing?
I want to ask you about fridges, to be honest. I want to read you something. This is an excerpt from the World Economic Forum's 2009 report. It's called Towards a More Energy Efficient World. Take a listen to this quote. The average refrigerator sold in the U.S. today uses 3/4 less energy than the 1975 average, even though it's 20% larger and costs 60% less in inflation-adjusted terms. Factors that have improved refrigerator efficiency include greater insulation, heavier doors that form a tighter seal, more efficient fans, motors, and compressors, and smarter controls that adapt to varying conditions. But Andrew, sounds pretty good. Are we talking about the Jevons Paradox again here of being applied to refrigerators in the sense that in the long term that efficient refrigerators could be not very efficient?
Well, there's peak refrigeration. In other words, that you can get wealthy enough where there's a point where having that added benefit of refrigeration doesn't mean you're just constantly getting a bigger one. You do have thresholds of in food preservation needs. I think the more important issue here is that what led to that in a substantial way was standards. Now remember, there are different factors that can lead to different behaviors and different outcomes. If you have a standard, tightening standard for air conditioner efficiency or refrigerator efficiency, or as has been the case recently, now finally we have movement on automobile efficiency, miles per gallon standards. That leads to fundamental changes that can outpace our ability to just sort of use more. And then, of course, you can have shifting values through education. People can, through their own education and edification, start to figure out ways to use energy less. But their standards matter. There are things that a president can do in the United States and that governments can do anywhere that can kind of push us forward in a direction that makes a lot of sense, that can get around some of those issues related to these paradoxes.
But standards do matter, and you mentioned cars, and the U.S. government last year has adopted these new standards for fuel economy of cars that they want in place, a reduction of 30% by 2016. And the government is saying that is going to save us a lot of oil consumption, but couldn't the proliferation of smart cars be subject to that same paradox, though? That people will drive more?
We do. Yeah, every time on my blog, a couple of times the last few years when gas prices spiked, and we noticed that there's transportation statistics show you about driving miles or passenger miles, and it all went down. And you think, oh, wow, look, we've finally done it. The price of gasoline got to a point where it's changing behavior fundamentally. And always what you've seen is, the last time that happened, we had the big gas price spike a couple of years ago, and now, again, not quite so markedly. But back in 1979, if you look at this graph of miles driven, was the same pattern. There was a downward turn, but then ultimately things kind of go up again. So yes, you do end up potentially in this realm where as prices go down, we tend to use more. And you even see this month to month in factors like the popularity of hybrids. What people are seeking in the marketplace for cars changes based on gas prices. And of course, that's a bummer because when you buy a vehicle now, you're locking in a 15 or 20 year decision. It's kind of like on a bigger scale what happens with power plants. When you invest in a multi-billion-dollar power plant, it's there for decades to come, and the owner wants to get that use out of it. So you're locked in that technology for the most part. And that's definitely an issue.
I want to read one more quote to you. This one comes from The New Yorker from back in December. Here's a little bit of that article. In 2004, a committee of the House of Lords invited a number of experts to help it grapple with a conundrum. The United Kingdom, like a number of other countries, had spent heavily to increase energy efficiency in an attempt to reduce its greenhouse emissions. Yet, energy consumption and carbon output in Britain, as in the rest of the world, has continued to rise. Why, asks the article. Andrew Revkin, Jevons Paradox at work again here?
Well, yeah, and this is more that macroeconomic version of it, where basically economic growth ends up happening at a faster pace than the improvement in energy use. And this leads many people in this arena, including me, to look down the pipeline at things like, how are we doing on energy innovation? In other words, can we speed up the curve of breakthroughs in things like energy storage or photovoltaics, solar panels, or other options that can really provide the kind of leap to a new, potentially a world where you finally break that pattern and have true decline in particularly energy use that results in emissions of greenhouse gases. Can you do that? And when I look at the amount of money flowing into basic research and development and demonstration projects on energy, it's a scant, tiny little amount compared to what we spend on, let's say, medical research, that kind of thing. So we're not really engaged in energy quest that would be required to break that pattern. Not even close yet.
You know, the author of that New Yorker article also makes another interesting point, which is that there's really no political risk to endorse energy efficiency. It's an easy one. And that I'm wondering then, how do we value that? You know, the benefits of efficiency are undeniable, I think, for the most part politically. But how do we put in that efficiency factor into how we value it? Because it's so easy to politically just say, yeah, it's a good thing.
These are challenging issues. The last president in the United States who kind of made a big deal out of turning down the thermostat, Jimmy Carter, got punished, of course, for doing that, wearing his sweater during his his chat with the public. And I think some of this cuts again against the fundamental human tendency toward moreness. And how do you shift that approach? How do you shift that sort of day-to-day sense of, in a human being, of using less when you could use more? Is a function of education, I think, to some extent, and just sort of a growing shift. I think we're heading slowly toward a shift in how we define our relationship with our environment toward a more productive one in the long run. But it's not, and this means, you know, it's like that same habit that you have to, it's a discipline, essentially. Think about if you come home from work and on the table there's a bowl of cookies and a bowl of apples. Most people would kind of, you can almost feel your hand going toward the cookies. And it takes a certain level of discipline, literally, to reach for the apple or to not eat at all. And that sense of discipline, Stuart Brand wrote a book called Whole Earth Discipline, his latest book, which I think has to be part of this in the long run. And it won't be enforced. It's not like we're going to have the global governance carbon police are ever going to be doing that. Somehow or other, some of that trait would come from within. And this relates not just to energy, but to food use and water and all those things, all the resource issues.
I want to ask you one last question before we leave it tonight, and that is, what broader lessons can we learn from Jevons Paradox as we move ahead? What can we take away from that?
Well, I think to some extent one lesson is that technology alone doesn't get you there. In other words, if we just keep getting more efficient, and even if you shift more toward renewable resources, sources of energy, that doesn't magically solve the world's environmental problems. And I think it gets at this larger issue of examining our traits as well as our tendencies, and trying to figure out, is there a new way for us to sort of develop a new norm for how we treat things that we've always thought of as sort of a fundamental right. In the United States, cheap energy has been essentially, it's not in the Constitution, but it's almost as if it is, in the sense that a politician can't violate the idea that we have the right to that. So dealing with that issue, I think, is vital as we go forward.
Okay, Andrew, we'll see you again on the program. Thank you for this tonight.
You're welcome.